They're waiting. Locked behind concrete and steel, inside some of the most secure prisons in the world, these men have already been judged, already been sentenced, already been marked for death, and still, they remain dangerous. Not because of what they might do next on the outside, but because of who they are, what they've already proven they're capable of. Even under constant surveillance, even in chains, even with nothing left to gain. And the first of our list is a man who was already sentenced once, already locked away. But for him, that wasn't enough. Because once he was inside, he turned the prison into his hunting ground. Lee Beamon. Some men enter prison already dangerous, others become dangerous once they're inside. Beamon did both, and what followed wasn't a loss of control, but a shift into something more deliberate. In 2005, in Jacksonville, Florida, his life was already unstable. Drug use, erratic behavior, and a pattern of escalation that had been building over time. On February 6th, that escalation turned into murder. Deborah Lacey, 47 years old, was attacked, restrained, and drowned in her bathtub. The killing wasn't instantaneous. It required time, physical control, and sustained pressure. Afterward, Beamon didn't try to distance himself from the crime. He and his girlfriend took Lacey's car and used it to obtain crack cocaine. That decision brought law enforcement directly back to them, and within days, both were arrested. At that point, he made a decision that would define the next phase of his life. He pleaded guilty. No trial, no drawn-out proceedings. In exchange, the death penalty was removed, and he received life in prison without parole. It was a permanent sentence, but not a terminal one. From the outside, it looked like the system had contained him. For a time, it appeared to be true. Years passed inside the Florida prison system without major incident. But beneath that routine, his behavior was changing. The instability that marked his first crime began to give way to something more controlled, more focused. By July 5th, 2012, that shift had taken form. Bruce Hunsicker became the first victim of it. Beamon didn't act on impulse. He observed him over time, identifying patterns and waiting for an opportunity where supervision dropped. He chose a prison shower, a confined space with limited visibility, and entered it with a weapon he had already prepared. The attack was prolonged. Hunsicker was stabbed repeatedly, far beyond what was necessary to cause death, before the violence escalated into strangulation. It was sustained, controlled, and deliberate from beginning to end. Afterward, Beamon cleaned himself, adjusted his appearance, and returned to the normal routine of the prison. That detail would later define how investigators understood the killing. In a prison environment, investigations move quickly. Movement is restricted, timelines are tight, and information spreads. It didn't take long to connect Beamon to the attack, but what stood out just as much as the method was the victim. Hunsicker had been convicted of sexual offenses involving a child. That detail aligned with what would come next. On January 22, 2017, Beamon killed again. This time, the victim was Nicholas Anderson, his cellmate. The setting removed the need for timing or isolation. The door was already locked, the environment already controlled. As before, the attack involved restraint, a weapon, and a combination of stabbing and strangulation that extended the violence rather than ending it quickly. And again, the victim had a history of sexual offenses. By this point, the pattern was clear. These were not random acts of prison violence. They were targeted, repeated, and carried out with a level of preparation that suggested intent rather than reaction. Beamon did not attempt to deny that. In letters to the court, he acknowledged the killings and described the reasoning behind them. He stated that targeting inmates with those convictions gave him a sense of satisfaction, and he indicated that he would continue under the same circumstances. He also made it clear that, in his view, the only way to stop that pattern was to place him somewhere he no longer had access to potential victims. The statement shifted how the case was viewed. This was no longer just a series of prison murders. It was a declared pattern with an expressed intent to continue. The legal outcome followed that shift. In January 2019, Beamon was sentenced to death for the murder of Bruce Hunsicker. Later that year, he received a second death sentence for the killing of Nicholas Anderson. The same system that had once spared him from execution now placed him on death row. At Union Correctional Institution, the environment changed significantly. Death row brought stricter isolation, constant monitoring, and heavily controlled movement. Contact with other inmates was limited, and opportunities for interaction were reduced to a minimum. In that setting, the pattern stopped, not because it had ended, but because it no longer had the space to continue. Life on death row is structured and repetitive. Days follow the same sequence, with little variation. But unlike a life sentence, there is a defined endpoint, even if the exact date is uncertain. For Beamon, that endpoint never came through the system. On June 10, 2020, he was found unresponsive in his cell. The death was ruled a suicide. There was no execution, no final statement delivered in a courtroom or behind glass. The case ended without the process reaching its intended conclusion. Rocky Beamon entered prison with one murder behind him. He left it with 3, not because prison failed to punish him, but because it failed to stop him. He was controlled, deliberate, a man who chose his victims and followed through with precision. But the next case doesn't follow that pattern, because not every dangerous man on death row is calculating. Some don't plan, some don't choose, and some don't even understand what they've done. And that makes them something else entirely. Harder to predict, harder to contain, and in some ways, even more dangerous. Andre Thomas. Some killers plan, some choose, and some don't understand what they're doing at all, but that doesn't make them less dangerous. In some cases, it makes them impossible to predict. Andre Thomas didn't begin with control. His story starts with something else, something that had been building long before anyone died. By the age of 9, he was already hearing voices. Not random noise, but something structured in his mind. He described them as angels, demons, entities speaking directly to him. And over time, those voices didn't fade, they got louder. Through adolescence, his behavior became increasingly unstable. Suicide attempts, substance use, episodes of paranoia that blurred the line between reality and belief. At times, he functioned well enough to move through daily life. At others, he drifted completely out of it. The pattern wasn't steady, it was unstable. In the weeks leading up to March 2004, that instability accelerated. His behavior became erratic, his thoughts increasingly consumed by religion and fear. At one point, he was found wandering, covered in blood after a suicide attempt. He was taken to a hospital, treated, and then released within days. The system saw him and let him go. On March 27, 2004, in Sherman, Texas, that decision caught up with everyone around him. He went to the apartment of his estranged wife, Laura Bonin. Inside were 3 people, his wife, their 4-year-old son, and her 13-month-old daughter. What happened next unfolded quickly at first, then slowed into something far more deliberate. The attack began with stabbing, repeated, uncontrolled, directed at all 3 victims, but it didn't end there. After the killings, the violence changed form. It became something else, something driven not by anger, but by belief. He opened their chests, removed organs, not randomly, but with purpose in his mind. He believed he was removing something evil from their bodies, that what he was cutting out wasn't flesh, but something spiritual. In his wife's case, he removed part of her lung, believing it to be her heart. In the children, he removed their hearts entirely. He thought he was saving them. Afterward, he turned the knife on himself. Multiple stab wounds to his own chest. He expected to die. When he didn't, the sequence continued. He placed the organs in his pockets, left the apartment, went home, and disposed of them. Then he contacted police. When officers found him, he wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was calm, cooperative, speaking in religious terms, explaining that God had instructed him to act, that the victims were not who they appeared to be. From his perspective, it made sense. After his arrest, that instability didn't settle. It escalated. Within days of being jailed, he removed his right eye with his bare hands. No weapon, no warning. Just a sudden act carried out inside a controlled environment. Psychiatric evaluations followed. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, initially ruled incompetent to stand trial and sent to a psychiatric facility. But after a period of treatment, the court reversed that decision. He was declared competent enough to face a death sentence. The trial began in 2005, and the central question wasn't what he did, but whether he understood it. The defense argued that he was legally insane, that his actions were driven entirely by psychosis and delusion. The prosecution countered with a different angle, that substance use had played a role, and under Texas law, that could weaken an insanity defense. In the courtroom, he didn't present as calculated or controlled. Observers described him as detached, at times confused, speaking in ways that reflected the same religious fixation that defined the crime itself. But the jury rejected the insanity defense. On November 3, 2005, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The case didn't end there. Questions were raised about the trial itself, the composition of the jury, statements from jurors expressing bias against interracial relationships, the broader issue of whether the process had been fair. Appeals followed. Challenges moved through state and federal courts. But the conviction held. On death row, his condition didn't stabilize. It deteriorated. Reports from inside described a man still experiencing hallucinations, still seeing things that weren't there, still reacting to a reality no one else could see. Unlike other inmates, his danger didn't come from calculated violence against others. It came from unpredictability, from the fact that no one, not guards, not doctors, not the system, could fully anticipate what he would do next. That became clear again on December 9, 2008. Inside his cell, alone without warning, he removed his remaining eye. This time he didn't stop there. He ate it. Later he explained why. He believed people were watching him through his eyes, that external forces could see his thoughts, monitor him, control him. Removing them wasn't self-destruction in his mind, it was protection. That moment changed everything. It left him completely blind, and confirmed that even under the most restrictive conditions available, his behavior could not be fully contained. The legal system continued to move forward. Appeals were filed, denied, reviewed again. In 2021, a federal appeals court upheld his conviction and sentence. An execution date was eventually set, April 5, 2023. But as that date approached, the same question resurfaced. Does he understand what's happening to him? In March 2023, the execution was delayed. Courts ordered further evaluation of his mental competency. And as of 2026, those questions remain unresolved. Hearings postponed. Evaluations complicated by the same issue that has defined his entire case. His mind doesn't operate within the system trying to judge him. Andre Thomas didn't become more controlled over time. He became less connected to reality, a man driven by voices, by beliefs no one else could see, acting without warning and without understanding. The system couldn't predict him. It could only contain him. And even then, barely. But the next man on this list isn't lost in his own mind. He knows exactly what he's doing. Every move, every decision, every act of violence. And unlike Thomas, nothing about it is accidental. Leo Boatman. Some men break the rules, others test the limits. Leo Boatman did something different. Every time the system tried to contain him, he adapted to it. His story doesn't begin in prison. It begins in instability. Born into dysfunction, raised through abuse and moved through a system that never fully settled him, Boatman's early life was already marked by violence and disruption. By 2006, that instability had escalated into something irreversible. In the Ocala National Forest, 2 college students, Amber Peck and John Parker, were found dead. They hadn't been attacked in a struggle that got out of control. They had been shot multiple times, their bodies left in shallow water, discarded in a place meant to delay discovery rather than hide it completely. The violence was direct, intentional, and final. When Boatman was arrested and convicted, the outcome seemed decisive. Life in prison. No parole. The system had removed him from the outside world. It hadn't removed the behavior. Inside prison, The escalation didn't pause, it evolved. In 2009, Boatman attempted to kill another inmate. The method wasn't random. He used bedsheets to hang the victim and forced pills into his mouth in an effort to finish what he started. The victim survived, but the pattern was already forming. A year later, in 2010, it continued. This time, the victim didn't survive. Ricky Morris, his cellmate, was beaten repeatedly. His head slammed into a concrete floor until the damage became fatal. It wasn't a quick altercation. It was sustained physical violence, carried out in a confined space where there was no escape and no interruption, until it was already too late. By that point, the system understood something had changed. Boatman wasn't just capable of violence, he was repeating it, and he was adjusting to the environment around him. The most defining moment came years later, in 2019. By then, Boatman had spent over a decade inside the prison system. Restrictions had increased, monitoring had tightened, movement was more controlled, but instead of limiting him, those conditions became something else, a problem to solve. The target was William Chapman. This wasn't impulsive, it was planned. For weeks, Boatman and another inmate observed the layout of the facility, identifying where cameras didn't fully cover movement. They found a blind spot, a small gap in surveillance where time could be stretched just enough, and they prepared. On the day of the attack, Chapman was brought into that space. The door was controlled, the timing deliberate. Once it began, it didn't stop. A ligature was used to restrain him while improvised weapons were brought into the assault. Boatman positioned himself between the victim and the entrance, physically blocking intervention. Guards responded, orders were given, chemical agents were deployed. It didn't matter. The attack continued for approximately 12 minutes, long enough for multiple intervention attempts, long enough for the system to react, and still not enough to stop it. That duration matters, because it shows something beyond violence. It shows persistence. By the time it ended, Chapman was dead, and Boatman had done something that defined his entire trajectory. He had carried out a controlled killing inside a monitored environment and kept going even as the system tried to stop him. The investigation that followed didn't rely on uncertainty. Surveillance gaps were identified, movements reconstructed. The planning, the coordination, the execution, all of it pointed in the same direction. This wasn't a breakdown. It was escalation. At trial, Boatman didn't present as unstable or disconnected. There was no claim of hallucination, no argument of lost control. Instead, what emerged was something more grounded and more difficult to contain. Anger, control, a willingness to act on both, even under maximum restriction. He waived jury sentencing, left the decision to the judge, and in the early 2020s, that decision came back as a death sentence. The system had already given him life once. It hadn't worked, now it escalated too. On death row, the structure tightens further. Isolation becomes constant. Movement becomes minimal. Contact is reduced to the smallest possible margin. It's designed for containment at the highest level available. For most inmates, that's the end of the pattern. For Boatman, it's simply the point where there are no more variables left to overcome. He remains there. Not because the violence disappeared, but because the environment finally removed the opportunity. Leo Boatman didn't stop when he was arrested. He didn't stop when he was sentenced. And he didn't stop when the system tried to control him. He adapted until there was nothing left to adapt to. And the next man on this list doesn't escalate over time. He arrives already there, violence fully formed, and far more calculated than anything that came before. Kenneth Allen McDuff. Some men are sentenced to die and never get the chance to prove why. Kenneth McDuff did, and the system paid for it. In 1966, near Waco, Texas, what began as a late-night drive for 3 teenagers turned into something far more controlled than it first appeared. Edna Sullivan, her boyfriend Robert Brand, and his cousin Mark Dunham were stopped, abducted, and taken away from the road into a rural area where no one would hear them. What happened next followed a sequence. The 2 boys were tied, then shot. Not in panic, not during a struggle, one step at a time. With them gone, the focus shifted to Sullivan. She was separated, assaulted, and taken deeper into isolation. And when the violence reached its final stage, it didn't end with a weapon. It ended with a car. He drove over her, then did it again and again, until there was nothing left to survive. That detail stayed with the case, not just because of how she died, but because of what it said about the man behind it. This wasn't just killing, it was control extended past the point of death. When Kenneth Allen McDuff was arrested and convicted in 1968, the system responded the way it was supposed to. Death sentence, final, permanent. It should have ended there. In 1972, it didn't. The Furman versus Georgia ruling erased death sentences across the United States, including McDuff's. Overnight, the punishment changed. Death became life. And in Texas at the time, life didn't mean what it sounded like. Years passed, and the system began to strain. Overcrowding, administrative pressure, policies designed to move inmates through rather than keep them contained. One of those policies was mandatory supervision, automatic release, even for men like him. Warnings were raised, concerns documented. People inside the system understood what he was. It didn't matter. In 1989, after 21 years in prison, Kenneth McDuff walked out, free. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the pattern returned. Women began to disappear across Texas, not in one place, not all at once, but enough to create a trail. Young women taken from everyday locations, parking lots, workplaces, places where routine made them predictable. The method followed a familiar structure: abduction, control, assault, then disappearance. One case brought it into focus. Melissa Northrup, 22 years old, vanished in 1992 from a parking lot in Waco. Witnesses saw her being forced into her own car. After that, she was gone, until her body was found in a remote area far from where she was last seen. By then, the connections were forming. This wasn't isolated, it was repeating. Investigators began tracing movements, building timelines, pulling together witness accounts, and eventually the case turned. Informants came forward, people who had seen enough to understand what they were looking at. The pressure closed in. In 1992, McDuff was arrested again, not for one crime, for a pattern that had restarted the moment he was released. The second trial didn't carry the same uncertainty as the first. This time there was history, there was precedent. There was proof that the earlier sentence hadn't just failed, it had allowed more deaths. In 1993, he was convicted again and sentenced to death. The difference now was that there would be no reversal, no policy shift, no release mechanism waiting in the background. The system had already made that mistake once. It wouldn't make it again. On death row, the structure held. Appeals moved through the courts, but the outcome didn't change. Years passed, but the sentence remained fixed, moving slowly toward its endpoint. Unlike the first time, this one was going to happen. On November 17, 1998, inside a Texas execution chamber, the process began. He was strapped to a gurney. The room was controlled, observed, procedural. No chaos, no improvisation, the exact opposite of how his victims had died. Before the injection, he spoke. An apology, acknowledgement, words directed toward the families of those he had killed. Then the sequence moved forward. The chemicals entered his system, and within minutes, it was over. Kenneth McDuff was pronounced dead, a case that should have ended in 1968. Finally ended 30 years later. But not before it proved something the system couldn't ignore. Some men don't change. Some men don't stop. And some men, when given a second chance, use it exactly the way you expect them to. And the next man on this list doesn't rely on second chances. He doesn't need time to escalate, because by the time anyone realized what he was, he had already done more than enough. Lawrence Bittaker. Some killers lose control when they act, others gain it. Lawrence Bittaker belongs to the second group, but even that doesn't fully describe what he became. His crimes weren't just violent. They were structured, refined over time, and carried out with a level of preparation that made them feel less like acts and more like a system being executed. That system didn't begin in 1979. It developed over years. By adulthood, Bittaker had already built a record of theft, assault, and kidnapping. Each arrest was followed by release, and each release was followed by escalation. There was no single turning point, only a steady progression toward more control, more intent, and more serious violence. When he met Roy Norris, that progression found reinforcement. Norris didn't create the direction of the crimes, but he made them easier to carry out. Together, they began testing methods before committing to them. They drove through Southern California, approaching young women, offering rides, and studying how long they could maintain control without raising suspicion. In multiple instances, they released those victims. Those encounters weren't failed attempts, they were rehearsals. By June 1979, the preparation shifted into execution. Victims were selected with consistency, teenage girls, often alone, in places where accepting a ride felt plausible. The approach was calm and controlled, built on brief interaction rather than force. Once inside the vehicle, that control changed form. The van they used, a modified GMC cargo vehicle, was not just transportation. The rear compartment was isolated from the front, creating a contained space where visibility and sound were limited. Once the doors closed, the situation became entirely dependent on them. That environment allowed time to stretch, and they used it. Victims were driven into the San Gabriel Mountains, far from populated areas, where interruption was unlikely. The violence that followed was not immediate. It unfolded over time, using tools that had been brought with purpose. The choice of those tools mattered less for what they were than for how they were used, gradually, repeatedly, and in a way that extended control rather than ending it. Across 5 months, at least 5 victims were killed in that pattern. Each case followed the same general structure, with adjustments made based on what had worked before. The repetition wasn't accidental. It was refinement. One case, however, left behind something different. Shirley Ledford, 16 years old, was abducted and taken into that same controlled space. During the attack, audio was recorded. It later became part of the evidence presented in court. The recording itself was not widely circulated, but those who heard it described it in similar terms. Investigators, prosecutors, and jurors noted the same reaction, not shock at a single moment, but difficulty processing the duration of what was happening. It wasn't just what occurred, it was how long it continued. That detail became central to understanding the case, because it confirmed what the pattern already suggested. The violence was not impulsive, it was sustained by design. The investigation moved forward when Norris spoke about the crimes to someone outside the partnership. That information reached authorities, and once the connection was made, the case began to come together quickly. Physical evidence, victim timelines, and Norris's statements aligned. Both men were arrested in November 1979. From there, their paths diverged. Norris agreed to testify in exchange for a life sentence, avoiding the death penalty. In doing so, he established the structure of their partnership in court. His testimony, combined with the physical evidence, placed Bittaker at the center of the planning and execution. The trial did not revolve around uncertainty. The evidence was direct, and the nature of the crimes was difficult to dispute. On March 24, 1981, Lawrence Bittaker was sentenced to death. What followed was not immediate. He spent decades on death row at San Quentin, moving through the appeals process that defines capital cases in California. During that time, his behavior remained consistent. Reports from those who interacted with him described someone composed, articulate, and capable of discussing his crimes without visible emotional shift. There were no major incidents, no visible deterioration, and no clear indication of change. Time passed, but it did not alter the underlying pattern. He remained under sentence of death for nearly 40 years. The legal system continued its process, but the execution itself never took place. On December 13, 2019, he died of natural causes at the age of 79. The sentence remained in place. The outcome did not. Lawrence Bittaker did not rely on impulse or on opportunity alone. His crimes were built on preparation, repetition, and control sustained over time, and that same consistency defined the decades that followed. And the next case moves in a different direction. Not toward structure, but away from it, into something far less controlled and far more unstable. Daniel Owen Conahan Jr. Some killers take their victims, force them, overpower them. Daniel Owen Conahan Jr. didn't need to. He convinced them to follow him. By the time he returned to Florida in the early 1990s, the pattern behind him was already forming. A history of instability, a discharge from the US Navy after a violent incident, and years drifting between places without anything anchoring him long-term. On the surface, he rebuilt something. Training as a nurse, working in a medical setting, living with family. But underneath that structure, the behavior didn't disappear. It adapted. Between 1993 and 1996, men began disappearing across parts of Florida, Charlotte County, Sarasota County, places where wooded land stretched far enough that someone could vanish without immediate notice. The victims shared similarities. Most were in their 20s or 30s. Many were struggling. Financially unstable, transient, or simply in situations where an offer of quick money felt worth the risk. That's where he entered. The approach wasn't aggressive. It didn't rely on force. He offered money, sometimes for photography, sometimes framed as a form of bondage modeling. It sounded controlled, almost transactional, something that required cooperation rather than resistance. And at first it did. Victims agreed. They got into his vehicle. They followed him. The shift didn't happen immediately. It happened once they reached the woods, remote areas cut through with narrow trails made by wild hogs, places difficult to navigate, easy to lose direction, and far enough removed that sound didn't travel. Once there, the dynamic changed. Restraints came out, rope, bindings, methods that relied on the victim already being compliant. And by the time they realized what was happening, the situation had already passed the point where resistance could change it. Control was already established. Bodies began to surface over time. Not all at once, and not always quickly. Some were found weeks later. Others took much longer. The terrain worked in his favor. Dense, uneven, difficult to search thoroughly. Many of the victims were discovered along those same narrow paths, giving the case its name. The Hog Trail Murders. Investigators began to see the pattern, but it wasn't immediate. The victims didn't always have strong connections. The locations were spread out, and without witnesses, the early cases remained isolated incidents rather than a clear series. That changed when the pattern failed. Stanley Burden was approached the same way as the others, the same offer, the same setup. He agreed, followed, and was taken into the same environment, restrained, controlled, put into the same position as the victims who had come before him. But this time, something broke. He survived. Details of how he escaped were less important than what came after. He was able to describe what had happened, how he had been approached, what had been offered, where he had been taken, and who had done it. For the first time, investigators weren't reconstructing a crime from a body. They were hearing it from someone who had been inside it. That account gave them something they hadn't had before, a name. Around the same time, another lead reinforced it, an inmate who reported that a man named Dan had attempted to lure him into a similar situation. The pattern was no longer theoretical, it was identifiable. On May 31, 1996, Daniel Owen Conahan Jr. was arrested. The case that moved forward centered on the murder of Richard Montgomery, whose disappearance had already drawn attention. Evidence connected Conahan to the crime, materials found in his possession, similarities in method, and the consistency of the pattern described by the survivor. At trial, the focus wasn't on whether the killing happened, it was on how many times it had happened. In August 1999, he was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The jury recommended the death penalty, and on December 10, 1999, the sentence was imposed. But the conviction didn't close the case, it expanded it. Authorities had already linked him to multiple victims, estimates ranging from 8 to 12, but the full number remained uncertain. Years later, in 2007, additional remains were discovered in wooded areas connected to the original investigation. Some were buried together, others were scattered. Identification took years, relying on DNA and forensic reconstruction. Even now, not all of them have names. That's what separates this case. It doesn't end with a verdict. It doesn't end with a sentence. It continues in fragments, remains found long after the crimes, identities recovered decades later. A pattern that was only partially understood even after the man responsible was in custody. On death row at Union Correctional Institution, Conahan remains where the system placed him. Unlike others, his danger wasn't built on chaos or escalation inside prison. It existed outside of it, structured around deception, patience, and the ability to turn agreement into control. He didn't need to chase his victims, he let them walk with him. And the next case doesn't rely on deception. It relies on something far simpler and far more direct. Thomas Andrew Knight. Death row is supposed to be the end, the final boundary, the place where violence stops because there's nowhere left to go. Thomas Andrew Knight proved that wasn't true. In 1974 in Miami, his first crime didn't unfold quickly. It stretched across hours, moving through public spaces where control had to be maintained without breaking. He targeted Sydney Gans and Lillian Gans outside their home, forcing them into a situation that didn't look like immediate violence but became it over time. He kept them alive, drove them from bank to bank, watched them withdraw money while surrounded by other people who didn't know what was happening. Every stop was a risk, every interaction an opportunity for something to go wrong, but it didn't. He stayed controlled, armed, and close enough to make resistance impossible. The crime wasn't rushed. It was managed. Only after the withdrawals were complete did it shift. He drove them out of the city, away from visibility, into a remote area where control no longer needed to be maintained, only enforced. There, he forced them out of the car and shot them. The escalation was gradual. The ending was not. When he was arrested and convicted in 1975, the system responded the way it was designed to. Death sentence. Final. At that point, his path should have been contained within a single trajectory: appeals, delays, and eventual execution. He was placed on death row at Florida State Prison, one of the most controlled environments available. Movement restricted, contact limited, constant supervision. The assumption was simple: nothing worse could happen. On October 12, 1980, that assumption failed. Inside the death row unit, during routine movement and interaction, Knight produced a weapon, a makeshift knife, concealed within an environment where weapons are not supposed to exist. How it was made mattered less than the fact that it existed at all. In a place built around restriction, he had found a way to create opportunity. The target was James Burke. The distance was close, too close. The attack happened quickly but not randomly. Multiple strikes, directed, deliberate, carried out before the environment could react fast enough to stop it. Even with the controls in place, even with the structure designed to prevent exactly this kind of event, it happened. That moment redefined the case, because this wasn't violence in the outside world. This was violence inside the system designed to contain it. Knight was tried again, this time for the murder of a correctional officer committed while already under sentence of death. There was no ambiguity in the outcome. He was convicted and sentenced to death a second time, twice condemned, for two separate murders. One of them carried out in the one place it should have been impossible. After that, the system adjusted, but the case remained. Years turned into decades. Appeals moved slowly, as they do in capital cases, but the sentence remained unchanged. He stayed on death row for nearly 40 years, becoming one of the longest-serving inmates in Florida history. Time passed. The status did not. Unlike others, his danger wasn't tied to escalation over time or instability under pressure. It was consistent. The same capacity for controlled violence that defined his first crime remained present years later under maximum restriction. That's what made the second killing matter. It wasn't a breakdown, it was continuity. On January 7th, 2014, the process finally reached its end. Inside a Florida execution chamber, he was secured to a gurney. The procedure carried out the same way it is for every inmate sentenced to death. Witnesses present, movements controlled, nothing left to chance. The system this time held. The injection was administered, and within minutes Thomas Andrew Knight was pronounced dead. A case that had already tested the limits of confinement ended the only way it could, through a process designed to remove all remaining variables. He committed murder in the outside world. Then he committed it again on death row. And in doing so, he left behind a question that cases like his always raise. Not whether the system can contain violence, but how much of it can exist inside the places built to stop it. And the next man on this list doesn't test the system from the inside. He operates outside it, moving through victims quickly, repeatedly, and with far less resistance. Rory Enrique Conde. Some killers take control by force. Others build it slowly, piece by piece, until the victim doesn't realize what's happening until it's already too late. Rory Enrique Conde belonged to the second group, but the control he created didn't come from confidence. It came from collapse. By the early 1990s, his life was already breaking apart. His marriage was failing, his behavior increasingly unstable, and the structure that had held him in place, work, family, routine, was starting to disappear. Reports of domestic violence and threats had already established a pattern of control inside his personal life. But when that control was lost, it didn't fade. It shifted. After his wife left with their children, the change became visible. He spent more time away from home, moving through areas where anonymity made interaction easier. The Tamiami Trail, a stretch of road in Miami known for transient activity and sex work, became part of that routine. It offered access and, more importantly, it offered victims who were used to negotiation. That mattered, because the approach didn't rely on force, it relied on agreement. The first known victim, Lazaro Comesana, was picked up along that same route and brought back to Conde's apartment. The encounter began like the others that would follow, transactional, controlled, contained within a private space. But once inside, the dynamic shifted. He moved behind the victim, using manual strangulation, applying pressure in a way that required proximity and control. The method didn't change after that. Over the next 5 months, he repeated it. Victims, mostly sex workers, were brought into the same environment, the same apartment, under similar circumstances. The setting remained constant. That was part of the pattern. Inside that space, there were no variables he didn't control. No witnesses, no interruptions, no uncertainty about what would happen once the door closed. The killings followed a sequence: approach, agreement, isolation, then control, strangulation from behind, often at moments when resistance was limited. Afterward, the bodies didn't leave immediately. They stayed in the apartment long enough for him to decide when and where to move them. Then they were transported, usually at night, and left along roadsides or in isolated areas where discovery would take time. The repetition wasn't accidental. It was routine. As the bodies began to surface, investigators started to recognize the pattern. The victims were connected by location, by circumstance, and by method. But what pushed the case further wasn't just the consistency, it was the change in behavior. At one crime scene, he left a message, written directly on the victim's body. It wasn't necessary for the crime. It didn't serve a purpose in concealment or escape. It served one purpose only: acknowledgement. He knew what was happening around him. He knew the investigation was forming. And he continued anyway. The killings didn't stop after warnings were issued. Police alerted sex workers along the Tamiami Trail, describing the pattern, the risk, the behavior to watch for. But the structure of his approach made those warnings difficult to act on. He didn't force his way in. He was invited. That's what made the pattern harder to break, until it finally did. Gloria Maestre was taken the same way as the others. The same offer, the same agreement, the same movement into the apartment. Once inside, the process began again. Restraints, control, isolation. But this time, something interrupted it. Neighbors heard noise, disturbance that didn't match the silence of previous crimes. Police were called. When they entered the apartment, they found her alive, bound, gagged, still inside the space where the pattern had been repeated over and over again. That moment changed the investigation completely. For the first time, there was a direct link between the environment, the method, and the person responsible. Her account provided details that couldn't be reconstructed from crime scenes alone. how he approached, how he controlled, how the situation changed once inside. The pattern wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a source. On June 19th, 1995, Rory Enrique Conde was arrested at his grandmother's house. Evidence from his apartment and vehicle, physical materials, DNA, connected him to multiple victims. During questioning, he didn't deny the crimes. He acknowledged them, linking his actions to the breakdown of his personal life, to anger, to loss of control. But the pattern told a different story, because nothing about what he did was uncontrolled. It was repeated, structured, maintained over time. At trial, the case focused first on the murder of Rhonda Dunn. The evidence was direct, supported by physical findings and his own statements. In 2000, he was sentenced to death. For a time, it looked like the system had reached its conclusion, but this case didn't follow a straight line. Years later, legal challenges changed the outcome. The Hearst versus Florida decision altered how death sentences were imposed in the state, and Conde's sentence was overturned. The punishment that had been decided years earlier was no longer final. He remained incarcerated, but no longer condemned to die. Rory Enrique Conde built control through repetition, through a pattern that relied on routine, environment, and the ability to turn agreement into confinement. And in the end, the system that judged him followed a pattern of its own. One that didn't hold, and the next case doesn't rely on repetition or control over time. It moves faster, with less structure and far less warning. Thomas Eugene Creech. Some cases are defined by what is proven, others are defined by what can't be. Thomas Eugene Creech sits somewhere in between, because the number attached to his name has never been fully settled, and likely never will be. By the time he was arrested in 1974, the system believed it was dealing with a single murder. The victim, Paul Schrader, was found in Idaho after what Creech initially described as an argument that turned violent. But even in that first case, the explanation didn't fully hold. The victim was vulnerable, isolated, and the attack showed more control than a sudden escalation would suggest. It looked like the beginning of a case. It may have been something else entirely. After his conviction, Creech was sentenced to life in prison, and for a moment, the pattern seemed contained. But inside the system, something unusual began to happen. He started talking. Confessions. Not one or two, but dozens. He described killings across multiple states, reaching back into the late 1960s and early 1970s. Hitchhikers, transients, people he encountered while moving from place to place. Some of the details aligned with unsolved cases, others couldn't be verified. Investigators were left in a position that rarely produces clarity. Some of it was true, some of it wasn't, and there was no clear way to separate the two. That uncertainty became part of the case, not just what he had done, but how much of it could be proven. Because even if only a fraction of those statements were accurate, it meant the original conviction had only captured part of the pattern. But it wasn't the confessions that changed his sentence. It was what happened next. On May 28, 1981, inside the Idaho State Correctional Institution, Creech killed again. The victim was David Jensen, another inmate. The setting mattered. This wasn't outside, not in an uncontrolled environment. This was inside a prison, where access is limited and movement is monitored. The weapon was simple, a sock filled with batteries. It didn't need to be more than that. The attack was carried out at close range, repeated blows delivered with enough force to make the improvised weapon effective. There was no complexity in the method, only persistence. Jensen died from the injuries, and the pattern that had been uncertain before became something else, confirmed. Because even without access to conventional weapons, even under confinement, Creech had found a way to carry out lethal violence. He was charged again, and this time, the outcome changed. In 1983, Thomas Eugene Creech was sentenced to death. The shift from life imprisonment to capital punishment came not from what he might have done, but from what he did inside the system itself. The prison had not contained him. It had simply changed the environment. What followed stretched across decades. Appeals, reviews, challenges. standard in capital cases, but extended here by time. Years turned into decades, and Creech became one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the United States. Throughout that period, the question of his confessions remained unresolved, hovering over the case without ever settling into certainty. How many victims were there? No one could answer it definitively, but the system still had an endpoint in mind. On February 28, 2024, that endpoint was set in motion. Inside the execution chamber, the process began as it always does: controlled, procedural, designed to remove uncertainty. Creech was prepared for lethal injection, the sequence moving forward under established protocol, and then it stopped. The issue wasn't legal, it wasn't last-minute appeals, it was physical. Officials were unable to establish a viable intravenous line. Multiple attempts were made, arms, legs, each one failing to produce the access required to proceed. Time passed, the procedure extended far beyond what was expected, and eventually, the decision was made to halt the execution. He was returned to his cell, alive. It's a rare outcome, and one that introduces a different kind of uncertainty. The sentence remains. The conviction stands. But the process meant to carry it out has already failed once, raising questions that don't have immediate answers. Will it be attempted again, and if it is, will it work? Thomas Eugene Creech remains on death row, the case still open in a way most are not. Not because of appeals or lack of evidence, but because the final step, the one meant to close everything, has already proven uncertain. He may have killed far more than can be proven. He has already killed inside the system meant to contain him. And when the system tried to end it, it couldn't. And the next man on this list doesn't leave that kind of uncertainty behind. His actions are clear, direct, and carried out with a level of finality the system doesn't have to question. Wayne Charles Doty. Most men on death row fight to stay alive. They appeal, delay, challenge every step. Wayne Charles Doty did the opposite. By the time he was arrested in 1996, the pattern already showed a willingness to cross the line without hesitation. In Plant City, Florida, a robbery at a manufacturing plant turned into something more final than it needed to be. The victim, Harvey Horn II, was not just shot to stop resistance. He was shot multiple times, including in the face. The escalation happened quickly, but it didn't look uncontrolled. It looked decisive. Violence carried out past the point where it was necessary to complete the crime. When Doty was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in 1997, the system treated it as a contained case, a single murder, a permanent sentence, an endpoint. For years, that held. He remained inside the Florida prison system, serving life without parole. No expectation of release, no immediate reason for further escalation. But the pattern didn't end. It waited. On May 17, 2011, inside Florida State Prison, Doty killed again. The victim was Xavier Rodriguez, a 21-year-old inmate. The setting mattered as much as the act. This wasn't outside, not in a place where opportunity could be created easily. It was inside a controlled environment, where access to weapons and movement are tightly restricted. The weapon was improvised. A shank. The attack was not brief. It combined stabbing with strangulation, a sustained assault carried out at close range. Another inmate, William Edward Wells, was involved, but the violence itself followed a pattern already seen before, direct, prolonged, and carried out without hesitation once it began. Rodriguez died from the injuries, and the case shifted immediately, because this wasn't a man facing life for a past crime. This was a man proving that life imprisonment had changed nothing. Doty didn't deny what he had done. He pleaded guilty, accepted responsibility. There was no attempt to distance himself from the act, no effort to challenge the outcome in the early stages. That mattered, because it set the tone for everything that followed. In 2013, Wayne Charles Doty was sentenced to death. A second legal process later reaffirmed that sentence after changes in Florida law required a new penalty phase. By 2018, the death penalty was imposed again, this time with unanimous agreement. At that point, the trajectory was clear, but his response to it was not. Most inmates begin the same process after sentencing: appeals, delays, legal challenges designed to extend time. Doty moved in the opposite direction. He filed motions to waive appeals, asked the court to move forward with execution. At one point, he specifically requested the electric chair instead of lethal injection. He wasn't resisting the sentence. He was aligning with it. That created a different kind of tension inside the legal system, because accepting death is not the same as being allowed to reach it. Courts are required to ensure competency, to verify that any decision to waive appeals is made knowingly and without impairment. Each time Doty pushed forward, the system slowed him down. Evaluations, reviews, delays, not to save him, but to confirm he understood what he was asking for. The result is a situation that rarely appears in cases like this. A man on death row not trying to escape the outcome, but waiting for it to be allowed. His sentence has been upheld, his responsibility acknowledged, and yet the process continues to move at its own pace, not his. As of now, Wayne Charles Doty remains on death row in Florida. No execution date set, no immediate resolution. The system still moving through the same steps it always does, regardless of whether the person at the center of it agrees with the outcome. He committed murder outside prison, then again inside it. And when the system responded with the highest possible punishment, he didn't resist. He accepted it, and has been waiting for it ever since. And the next name on this list doesn't wait. He acts, again and again, in ways that leave far less time for the system to respond. William Edward Wells. Not every escalation comes with a plan. Some don't need one. William Edward Wells doesn't stand out for how he began. In 1994, his first murder followed a pattern the system had already seen many times before. The victim, Carolyn Barnes, was killed in an assault that went beyond a single act of violence. The attack was prolonged, physical, and sustained. Force applied repeatedly until it ended in death. There was no larger pattern attached to it, no series, no wider investigation. Just one case, one conviction, and one sentence: life in prison without parole. At that point, the system had done what it was designed to do: remove the threat, contain it, and prevent it from happening again. For years, that's exactly what it looked like. Wells remained inside the Florida prison system, another inmate serving out a sentence with no expectation of release. Nothing suggested escalation. Nothing suggested continuation, until it happened again. On May 17, 2011, inside Florida State Prison, Wells was involved in the killing of Xavier Rodriguez. The environment was controlled, monitored, designed to prevent exactly this kind of event. But like other cases before it, the setting didn't eliminate violence. It changed how it was carried out. The attack involved multiple forms of force: stabbing and strangulation, delivered at close range and sustained long enough to leave no ambiguity about intent. Wayne Charles Doty was there, part of the same assault, but the presence of another person doesn't reduce what happened. Wells didn't step back. He didn't disengage. He continued. That's what defines the moment. Not leadership, not planning, but participation that doesn't stop once it begins. The same pattern from his first conviction appeared again, not as escalation in method, but as consistency in behavior. When violence started, it was carried through to its end. Rodriguez died from the injuries, and with that, the case changed. Because this wasn't a man who had committed a crime in the outside world and then been contained by prison. This was someone who carried the same capacity for sustained violence into an environment designed to restrict it, and used it again when the opportunity appeared. The legal consequences followed the pattern already established by similar cases. A second murder while serving a life sentence shifted the stakes. Prosecutors pursued the death penalty, arguing that incarceration had failed to prevent further violence. In 2013, William Edward Wells was sentenced to death. Like others in Florida, that sentence didn't remain untouched. Changes in how death penalties were imposed led to a new penalty phase, and in 2018 the sentence was reaffirmed. The legal process moved forward, but without the same resistance seen in other cases. There was no push to accelerate it, no attempt to bring it closer, just the standard progression. Appeals, reviews, time passing within the structure of the system. That's where Wells separates from others on this list. He doesn't reshape the system around him. He doesn't challenge it in a way that changes the narrative. He remains inside it, defined almost entirely by the two moments where the pattern broke through containment. One in 1994, one in 2011. Everything else is structure, process, time. As of now, William Edward Wells remains on death row in Florida, his sentence upheld, his case settled in legal terms. There are no unresolved questions about what happened, no uncertainty about responsibility, and no ambiguity in the outcome that was assigned to him. What remains is the pattern, a first act of sustained violence, followed by a second in a place where it wasn't supposed to happen again. He didn't need a system to fail. He didn't need a plan to evolve. He only needed the moment. And when it came, he didn't stop. And the next case doesn't wait for opportunity in the same way. It creates it. Over and over again, across victims, across time, and with far more structure than anything that came before. William George Bonin. Some killers escalate over time, others repeat. William George Bonin built his pattern on repetition, structured, consistent, and carried out often enough that it stopped feeling like isolated crimes and started to look like routine. Long before 1979, the warning signs were already there. A childhood marked by instability and abuse, followed by early arrests, detention, and a documented history of sexual violence. By the early 1970s, he had already been convicted for assaulting young males. That conviction should have marked a boundary. It didn't. After his release, the behavior didn't disappear. It continued beneath the surface, unchanged in direction, waiting for the right conditions to expand. When it did, it didn't evolve into something new. It repeated. Beginning in May 1979 in Southern California, young males started disappearing. Teenagers, hitchhikers, individuals used to accepting rides from strangers. The approach was simple. A van pulled over, a conversation, an offer of transportation that felt ordinary enough to accept. Once inside, the structure took over. Restraints were used quickly. Cords, wires, methods that limited movement and removed control from the victim almost immediately. Unlike cases where violence unfolds slowly in a single location, Bonin's pattern relied on movement. The van was not just a place of control. It was a way to transition victims between locations, to keep them contained while the situation evolved. The assaults followed, repeated acts carried out with consistency across victims. The method didn't need to change because it worked. Control was established early, maintained through proximity and restraint, and carried through until the final stage, strangulation. That was the endpoint in most cases, direct, physical, and consistent with the pattern he had established. Afterward, the bodies were removed from the vehicle and left along highways or in isolated areas, spaced out across locations that made immediate connection between cases more difficult. But the pattern was there. It repeated too often to ignore. What set William George Bonin apart wasn't just the number of victims, it was how frequently the pattern was executed. Between 1979 and 1980, the cycle continued with little interruption, each crime following the same structure, each victim fitting into the same sequence. And he didn't always act alone. That's where the pattern expanded. Bonin involved multiple accomplices, young men who participated at different levels, from assisting in abductions to directly engaging in the violence. Their presence changed the dynamic. It made the crimes easier to carry out, extended control over victims, and increased the frequency with which the pattern could repeat. This wasn't a single individual acting in isolation. It was a system with multiple participants. That made it harder to stop. The investigation gained traction as connections formed between cases, victim profiles, locations, methods. Physical evidence began to align with witness statements, and eventually those connections led back to him. When he was arrested in June 1980, the pattern didn't need to be reconstructed from fragments. It was already established. By that point, he had been linked to at least 14 murders, with indications of more. Accomplice testimony reinforced the structure of the crimes, confirming what investigators had already begun to see. The trial focused on the pattern, not just individual acts, but repetition, consistency, volume. In 1982, William George Bonin was sentenced to death. Additional convictions in other jurisdictions followed, reinforcing the scope of what had been uncovered. The legal process moved forward, but unlike some cases where uncertainty remains, this one was defined by clarity. The pattern was proven, the responsibility established. He spent the following years on death row at San Quentin, moving through the appeals process that accompanies capital cases in California. Time passed, but the structure of the case didn't change. The evidence remained consistent, the convictions upheld. On February 23, 1996, the process reached its conclusion. Inside the execution chamber, the procedure followed the same controlled steps used in other cases, measured, deliberate, designed to end what had been established years earlier. The injection was administered, and within minutes William George Bonin was pronounced dead. A pattern that had repeated across victims, across locations, and across time finally stopped. Not because it changed, but because it was ended. He didn't need complexity. He didn't need variation. He only needed repetition. And for as long as it continued, it worked. And the next case doesn't rely on repetition at that scale. It narrows the focus. But what it loses in volume, it replaces with something far more personal. Thomas Arthur Weisenhunt. Some killers try to disappear after the crime. Others try to control what happens next. Thomas Arthur Weisenhunt did something different. He made sure people knew. Long before the murders, the pattern was already visible. Instability in childhood, documented psychiatric issues, escalating behavior that didn't just suggest violence, but fixation. By his teenage years, he wasn't only expressing anger, he was describing it, talking about it, directing it towards specific targets, women. That focus didn't fade with time, it narrowed. By the mid-1970s, in the Mobile, Alabama area, the pattern moved from words into action. Women working alone, often in convenience stores, became the point of contact. The approach was direct. A weapon, control established immediately, and removal from the location before anyone could intervene. The structure was consistent: abduction, transport, isolation, and then the killing. The victims, Alice Schramm, Dolores Doss, Priscilla Peterson, were taken out of public spaces and into environments where control could be maintained without interruption. The violence itself followed the same progression each time, not rushed, not improvised, but carried out with enough consistency to establish a pattern. But what set this case apart didn't end with the murders. It continued after. Thomas Arthur Weisenhunt didn't disappear into silence. He inserted himself into the investigation, contacted a newspaper, claimed responsibility, suggested there were more victims than authorities had confirmed. It wasn't necessary. It didn't reduce risk, it increased it. That's what made it different. Because the goal wasn't just control over the victim, it was control over the narrative. When he was arrested in 1977, the case moved quickly. Witness descriptions, investigative leads, and his own statements aligned. He confessed, reinforcing what the evidence had already established. The system responded the way it does in cases with that level of clarity. Conviction, death sentence. It should have ended there, it didn't. What followed was not escalation, not additional violence, but something that stretched the case in a different direction. Time. The first conviction was overturned, forcing a retrial. In 1981, he was convicted again and sentenced to death a second time. But even then, the case didn't close. Appeals continued. Legal challenges focused on procedure, on conduct, on mental health considerations that had been present since the beginning. Years passed, then decades. The sentence remained, but the outcome stayed out of reach. Each appeal delayed it further, turning what had been a clear case into one of the longest-running death row timelines in the United States. More than 40 years passed between conviction and execution. That duration became part of the story, not just what he had done, but how long it took to resolve it. During that time, Thomas Arthur Weisenhunt remained on death row in Alabama, the case moving forward slowly, piece by piece, through a system designed to avoid error even when the facts were already established. The violence didn't repeat, but the presence remained. On May 25, 2023, the process finally reached its end. Inside an Alabama execution chamber, the procedure followed the same controlled sequence used in every capital case: measured, deliberate, without deviation. The delay ended. The sentence was carried out. And after more than 4 decades, Thomas Arthur Weisenhunt was pronounced dead. A case that began with compulsion and extended through time longer than most, finally closed. But not before showing something different from the others on this list. He didn't just commit the crimes, he made sure they were seen. And the next case doesn't rely on control, repetition, or time. It narrows even further into something more immediate and far more personal. Juan Carlos Chavez. Some cases unfold slowly, others happen all at once and never really end. On March 8, 1995, Jimmy Rice stepped off his school bus in a quiet area of Miami-Dade County and began walking home, following the same routine he had followed before. It was ordinary, predictable, the kind of moment that doesn't draw attention. That's what made it vulnerable. Juan Carlos Chavez was there, and the shift from routine to control happened quickly. An approach, a forced entry into a vehicle, and within seconds the situation had already moved beyond anything the environment around it could stop. There was no prolonged interaction, no visible struggle that drew intervention, just disappearance. The search began almost immediately. Family, law enforcement, the local community, all working within a narrowing window where time mattered more than anything else. Every hour increased the distance between where he had been last seen and where he might be. The urgency was clear, but the control had already been established elsewhere. Chavez took the child to a trailer where he was living, a private space removed from public view. That shift, from open road to closed environment, changed everything. Inside that space, there were no witnesses, no interruptions, no immediate pressure from the search that was building outside. There was time, and he used it. The child was restrained, held, and kept under control before the final act. The violence did not happen at the moment of abduction. It happened after, inside a space where the outcome was already determined. When the killing occurred, it was direct, final, and then the focus shifted again, from control to concealment. The investigation continued to expand, but like many cases involving abduction, it lacked a clear direction at first. Leads came in, tips were followed, but nothing immediately connected to a single point. What changed the case wasn't a random discovery, it was proximity. A co-worker of Chavez became suspicious, behavior that didn't align, something that felt out of place. That suspicion led investigators closer, and eventually, to the trailer itself. Inside, they found what the search had been missing: connection, evidence that tied the location, the suspect, and the disappearance together. Once that point was reached, the case moved quickly. Juan Carlos Chavez was arrested, and under questioning, he confessed. The sequence that had been built through investigation was confirmed: abduction, restraint, killing, disposal. The uncertainty ended. The trial that followed focused on the clarity of that sequence. The evidence was direct, supported by physical findings and his own statements. In 1999, he was convicted and sentenced to death. But the case didn't stop there, because what happened next extended far beyond the courtroom. The murder of Jimmy Rice led to the creation of the Jimmy Rice Act, a law designed to manage individuals considered sexually violent predators even after they complete their prison sentences. It changed how the system approached risk, not just punishment after a crime, but prevention before another could occur. That's what separates this case. The crime was immediate, the impact wasn't. Years passed as Juan Carlos Chavez remained on death row, moving through the appeals process that defines capital cases. Unlike others on this list, the timeline here didn't stretch across decades of uncertainty or repeated retrials. The outcome stayed fixed. On February 12, 2014, inside a Florida execution chamber. The process followed its final sequence. Controlled, measured, no deviation from procedure. The sentence was carried out, and within minutes, it was over. A case that began with a routine moment, a child walking home, ended in a way the system could finalize. But the effect of that moment extended far beyond the individual responsible for it. It changed the law, changed the response, changed what happens after cases like this occur, because some crimes don't just end with a sentence. They reshape everything that comes after. And the next case moves away from opportunity and speed into something quieter, but just as deliberate. Edward Harold Schaefer. Not every story on this list ends in an execution chamber. Some end in a cell. Edward Harold Schaefer began like others, violence outside, control taken in a moment that should have remained ordinary. In 1975, in Baltimore County, 9-year-old Carla Brown was walking home from school, following a routine that didn't invite attention, until it did. The approach was quick, control established before the environment could respond. She was taken from a public space into isolation, where the outcome was no longer uncertain. The pattern, abduction, removal, cuttle, followed the same structure seen in other cases, but here it remained contained to a single crime. There was no series, no escalation beyond that moment. When Schaefer was identified, arrested, and later confessed, the system responded in a different way than it had for others on this list. In 1976, he was sentenced to life in prison. Not death, life. At that point, the case should have settled into permanence. No further violence expected, no additional escalation, just time stretching forward inside a system designed to contain him indefinitely. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. Years passed, then more. His name faded from public attention, replaced by newer cases, more immediate threats, and more visible outcomes. Inside prison, however, the definition of his crime didn't change. It remained attached to him, not as history, but as identity. And inside that environment, identity matters, because over time, the role shifted. He was no longer the immediate threat. He became the target. By 2010, more than 30 years after his conviction, Schaefer was housed at Jessup Correctional Institution in Maryland. The system had done what it was designed to do: keep him contained, keep him alive, keep him separated from the outside world. But it couldn't remove what he had done. On April 27, 2010, that past became present again. His cellmate, Robert Gleason, had already established a pattern of violence inside prison. This wasn't a random act, it was intentional, directed. The choice of target wasn't based on opportunity alone, it was based on what Schaefer represented. The attack was controlled, deliberate, carried out in close quarters where there was no escape and no time for intervention once it began. By the time it ended, Edward Harold Schaefer was dead. The system that had kept him alive for decades had not failed in the way it does in other cases. There was no escape, no outside victim, no breakdown of confinement. Instead, the violence stayed inside the system itself, redirected. Afterward, Robert Gleason was charged, convicted, and sentenced to death for the killing. The legal process moved forward again, but this time with a different structure. Schaefer was no longer the subject of the case. He was part of its outcome. That's what separates this chapter from the others. Most of the men on this list were executed by the state, their sentences carried out through a controlled process designed to end what they had done. Schaefer's sentence was never completed that way. It ended in a cell. After decades of incarceration, after time had distanced the crime from public view, the identity tied to it remained strong enough to make him a target. The violence he had once carried out became the reason it returned to him, not through the system but from within it. He committed a crime that defined him for the rest of his life. And in the end, that definition was enough.